Morning, y'all. A few months ago, while looking for information about the sixth source, I came across a series of sermons by a minister, Philip Baber. I found his comments on the sources to be both informative, clarifying, and sometimes surprising, so I thought I'd share some of them with you today, as well as my own reflections and experiences on my sort of trip through religions. Unitarian Universalism is a covenantal faith. Our 7 principles are our covenant. They start with, we covenant to affirm and promote. Our affirmation of faith ends with the sentence that starts, we covenant with one another to dwell together in peace. We have covenants for the church board, and we have covenants for the small groups that gather, which serve as guidelines for how the activities in the groups are conducted. We are not creedal in that we do not have specific beliefs. So the first statement that caught my eye by surprise is Baber's statement that the 6 sources define who we are better than the 7 principles because the 7 principles don't concretely separate us from other religions or other secular organizations. For example, when I took my best friend from England to Nauvoo, a Mormon approached me and asked me about my religion. I started by telling her about our 7 principles, and after I'd recited the first one, she was very impressed and very receptive and agreed. Yes, that's wonderful. Additionally, the 6 sources represent nearly every major stream of theology and philosophy that is within our faith movement, and they are a more detailed and meaningful example of our diversity. Baber advises that we consider the sources collectively because they cannot be separated and still retain their meaning. Since our UU community is filled with theological diversity, our truth and wisdom won't consistently come from a single source. We need to try and understand their relationships and their natural tensions. For example, number 1 addresses transcendence and awe, and number 5 values science and reason. Before I begin talking about the 6 sources, I'd like to mention that we had a summer discussion series on these about a decade ago, and each of us got a source to explore and present to the group. Now you can find these in the front of your hymnal, just go a few pages in, and they're also going to be put on the screen here. So we're going to, if you're comfortable, you can read them aloud as I read them, if that's your learning style. Otherwise, I'm going to break them down for you. So, source 1, direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces that create and uphold life. I see Mike. Oh, Mike remembers this in our discussion group. It was like,
we didn't find it in the front of the hymnal.
I'm sorry?
We did not find it in the front of the hymnal.
Oh, in the front of this hymnal? Just a little bit in, okay? Just a little bit in, just keep going. It's only a few pages. It's maybe 4 or 5 pages in. Go page by page there, okay? It got on the screen, right? Yeah, it's on the screen. Okay, we were a little bit, when we were doing the discussion group, we were like, what? Who's going to take this one? I think Mike might have done that. Yes, you did it, right, Mike? Yeah, I think he did. So that is a lot to take in. So I'm going to look at the first clause first. Direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures. This is universal. Our prime source is experiential. By connecting to the wonder, beauty, and mysteries of the nature and natural world and what is greater than ourselves, is the only way to make sense of the rest of our sources. And now, since we're talking about transcending, a little background about the Transcendentalists. Excuse me a second. I have a very dry mouth. Transcendentalism was a reform movement in the Unitarian Church in the mid-19th century. Transcendentalists were religious naturalists espousing a spiritual sixth sense, embracing the idea of universal brotherhood, communing with the divine, and the sacredness of the natural world. It developed into a religious subculture, with some ministers branching off and forming their own independent congregations. This started a Unitarian civil war with charges of heresy, anarchy, and irreligion from the conservative faction. Eventually, the Transcendentalist view prevailed, and its views of religious intuition, social reform, and spiritual seeking in nature. By the way, a short time before that, a young Universalist was organizing his own church. His name was Joseph Smith. Yes, that Joseph Smith. Mormons acknowledge, he's calling. Hey, find some more tablets? Soup, bad girl. Mormons acknowledge their Universalist lineage and recognize it as an important stepping stone in the development of Mormonism. Now, I was surprised at first, but then I remembered that they are Latter-day Saints, and when they die, they each get their own planet. So that kind of makes more sense, Bonnie. The second clause in Source 1 continues, that which moves us to a renewal of the Spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. Simply said, this clarifies that not all direct experiences are equal. We only accept those experiences that are positive and life-affirming. Any experiences that are destructive to life, such as oppressing other people, are not acceptable. Source 2. Words and deeds of prophetic people who challenge us to confront powers and structure of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. Baber looked into the etymology of the word prophet and came to a novel interpretation of this source. We tend to think of a prophet as a religious figure. The root of this Greek word, phanai, means to speak. Just that, to speak. But the prefix has more than one possible meaning. It can mean before, as in time. That makes it predictive, like he speaks before something happens. The sun is going to go dark next month, for example. It can mean before in space, as I am here speaking in front of you. And a third possible can mean the first, as in the first person to speak. Now, when translating Jewish scriptures into English, the Hebrew word usually translated as prophet is navi, but it has nothing to do with seeing the future. This word navi has to do with speaking, but specifically rebuking. So that's a tad harsher than a reprimand. So when you read the Old Testament, change the word prophet to rebuker. Now you get who's being rebuked in the Old Testament? The rich, the powerful, and the privileged. So following Baber's train of thought, prophets are the first ones to demand change and challenge injustice. And who are our rebukers, our prophets today? Who speaks up first when threatened, when justice is threatened? Those would be our social justice warriors, the ones who act on injustices in the here and now. Our second source calls on us to be the first followers of those first speakers. Source 3. Wisdom from the world's religions, which inspires us in our ethical and spiritual life. There are perhaps 4,200 world religions, not counting the different denominations within them. Christianity, for example, has over 30,000 distinct denominations. That's a very large menu to choose from. So I'm going to just focus on my experiences, as I'm sure you each have had your own experience as you've traveled through your life. When I went to college back in the early 70s, I enjoyed the humanities classes that covered religion and philosophy, and I had a wonderful professor who taught us about Taoism. He taught world literature as well, and was always pointing out examples of Taoism in the literature. While I was intrigued by the other Eastern philosophies, Taoism really captured my attention for its deep reverence for nature, and I was particularly intrigued by Lao Tzu's quote, "Those who do not know speak. Those who speak do not know." I later took a class on comparative religions to see what they all had to offer. I continued to be more drawn to the Eastern religions and philosophies than the monotheistic religions. For me, one of the most attractive aspects of UUism is its acceptance of the wisdom and perspectives of other religious traditions. I love that we are curious about other faiths and their beliefs. I love that we are open-minded and able to change our minds. And I'm grateful that we can, each one of us, choose our own path without criticism. Source 4. Jewish and Christian teachings which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. I need a drink. Source 4 is probably the most emotional and divisive. This is understandable because many of us, and not just us here in this congregation, but in all UU congregations, we're seeking an alternative to the dogmatic, ultra-conservative, and judgmental doctrines of some Christian churches. Some have even experienced legitimate trauma. Others, myself included, just had a lot of questions and doubts about what we were being taught to believe. So, here's a brief summary of the beginnings. Judaism came first, existing for around 2,000 years. Then Jesus of Nazareth showed up. He was a Jewish rabbi who was trying to reform religion. Then he died. And afterwards, his followers called themselves Christians, as in little Christs. At this time, there are no written accounts of his life, Jesus' life, actions, and back then, being a Christian encompassed a large diversity of beliefs about his messages, aka his sermons. Most of the written accounts didn't come until well over 200 years after his death, and we can only rely on what the scribes wrote and what the scribes who copied the scribes, what they wrote, rewrote, and so on. The very early Christians hadn't decided yet whether Jesus was God. This decision happened over 300 years after he died, and it was decided at the Council of Nicaea. While Christianity began as a Jewish sect, many decided they had outgrown Judaism and broke away. Weber suggests that Christianity could be called a trans-Judaic faith. In other words, Christianity went through Judaism and came out on the other side with changes. In the 4th century, the Roman Empire sought to turn Christianity into its official state religion in order to control its citizens. Imagine that. The Christians were compelled to create an official set of orthodox beliefs as Rome forced them to settle on a single theology. Christians fought each other and killed each other over this until finally the Council of Nicaea made its decision and recognized Jesus is God, enshrined the Holy Trinity. They declared that Jesus physically rose from the dead. They established the doctrines of a literal heaven and hell. Literal heaven and hell. And here, my friends, is where we come in. The Christians who accepted the Trinity and hence Jesus' divinity were Trinitarians. Those who could not accept this as a doctrine were Socinians, also known as Unitarians, and were labeled heretics. They still followed Jesus' teachings, but were disowned by the Trinitarians. Others accepted Jesus' divinity, but refused to believe in a God who would punish people to eternal hell. So they believed that everyone would be saved by a loving God, and they became the Universalists. And they too were labeled heretics. Despite being suppressed by the ruling Orthodox Christians, Unitarians and Universalists kept coming back, and each showed up independently in our colonies. In 1961, they joined forces and hyphenated their name. Were they still Christian faiths, though? Philip Baber proposes that we are a trans-Christian faith, like the originals were. Christians were a trans-Judaic faith. We went through Christianity, came out the other side different. Can a UU also be a Christian? Certainly. Our theological freedom is the core of who we are, with the liberty to be a free-thinking and questioning heretic, and in opposition to the orthodoxy imposed on other faiths. Like the second source, this one has a qualifying clause. This calls on us to accept those teachings which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Or as a little Catholic kid sitting in catechism used to think, well, Jesus wants us for us to be, all he wanted was for us to be nice to one another. And if you're wondering, like I am, about where is Islam in this, there is a petition that was started in 2022 asking for it to be included in this particular source. Source 5. Humanist teachings, which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against the idolatries of mind and spirit. In our discussion group on sources, I chose this one. It led to a lively discussion on laws of physics, quantum mechanics, and the existence or non-existence of free will. Isn't it refreshing to have a faith that believes science is real? A religion that invites us to stretch our reasoning and our intellects. Where did our humanist influence come from? From the Unitarians, mostly. It seems evident that these were the first among the Christians who emphasized Jesus' human aspect instead of accepting his divinity. It came to focus on human potential and human responsibility. I apologize for this, but it's so dry. Joseph H. Dietrich from Pennsylvania was an early 20th century minister known as the father of religious humanism. He was a gifted speaker with hundreds of thousands of listeners and was considered a rock star. He was particularly religiously liberal. This got him defrocked by the Reformed Church, which is a conservative Calvinist denomination, still exists today, I believe. So the Unitarians welcomed him with enthusiasm, and he began to preach his message of a new faith without God. It sparked the humanist-theist controversy. For several years, Dietrich's position suggested that reason and science were the only valid, reliable source of finding the truth. Non-theism mutated into anti-theism, with the consequence of alienating those who believed in the divine and the supernatural. Tables turned, and theism became the marginalized group, and the humanists became the ruling majority. So reason took its place at the top. But hyperhumanism had its consequences. Hyperhumanists' UU societies had banned and therefore lost the language of reverence, that language used to describe aspects of human life which, although irrational, can all be very real. As Philip Baber put it, we had regained our mind, but we had lost our soul. After his retirement in the 1940s, Dietrich expressed his regret, saying, "The way in which I cut mankind off from all cosmic relationship was a very short-sighted and arrogant decision." It took a while, but we have learned that every one of our 6 sources has its time and place, its own virtues, and its limitations. Source 6. Spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. I will use the word pagan while I talk about this source, primarily because our UU pagans have embraced it as an affirmation of their traditions which predate Christianity. The term pagan comes from the Latin for rustic individual. In other words, a rural person, like me. The early Christians were almost exclusively urban dwellers and came to use the term pagan as an insult to denote someone who was non-Christian. It's now been reclaimed by those non-Christians, aka pagans, to affirm their identity based on these traditions and practices that, again, predated Christianity. How it came to be our 6th source has a connection to events that began in the last part of the 20th century. It was added around the same time as our 7th principle. When the Unitarians and Universalists came together and joined up in 1961, the UUA was made up mostly of humanists and liberal Christians. At the UUA General Assembly in 1977, a resolution called Women and Religion exposed the anti-woman language and symbolism in our liturgy and theology. When it passed, the Continental Women and Religious Committee was formed, and 3 years later sponsored the first known organized Unitarian Universalist pagan worship service. The service included goddess theology, a witchcraft workshop, a Zen Buddhist film, and the first ever water communion. Soon after, the Covenant of Unitarian Universalist Pagans, that's CUUPS, was formed. It honors the goddess-based, earth-centered, tribal, and pagan spiritual paths. The 6th source was added in 1995. This demographic is the fastest growing in UUism. And why is that? Philip Baber identifies 3 themes in his sermon. First, paganism has deep roots in feminism and women's liberation, celebrating the wisdom and power of the divine feminine, aka the goddess. The Abrahamic faiths have suppressed the voice and power of women through the centuries. Second, the rise of environmentalism. Earth-based traditions revere our planet and nature. This is again a reaction against the Abrahamic faiths and religions that have been accomplices in the degradation of our planet, devaluing the physical world while elevating the spiritual. There's an afterlife. Our oldest spiritual traditions were nature-centered. They celebrated nature's mundane miracles. We need this revitalized reverence for nature now. Finally, paganism offers us a path back to our emotions and bodies. We've been taught to keep our emotions under control, bottled up. We have been taught by other religious traditions that our bodies are sinful. Paganism lets us reclaim the emotional and mystical expressions of worship and reconnect with our more primal roots. Our sources define who we are. If each is taken on their own, they don't sufficiently show our diversity. Taken collectively, they show our diverse theology. I'm pleased to be part of a faith tradition that recognizes that all religions have something to offer and that respects those different perspectives. At the end of the last century, I took a little quiz on a site called beliefnet.com, which is designed to tell the user which religion suits them. My top 4 came out as secular humanism, liberal Quaker, neo-pagan, and number 1 was Unitarian Universalism. I didn't even know what it was at the time. And the bottom 3 in order went Eastern Orthodox, Islam, and at the very bottom, Roman Catholic. Sometimes it takes us like 60 years to find where we belong, and I'm so glad I did.